What if the gods of the oldest civilization on Earth didn't arrive at the beginning of history, but after its destruction? What if the Anunnaki weren't creators of the first world, but witnesses to the end of another? There is a silence that exists before recorded history, a vast, unknowable quiet that stretches back through millennia we cannot see, cannot touch, and may never fully understand. We speak of ancient civilizations as though they represent the beginning of human memory. The pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the temple complexes of the Indus Valley. These are the monuments we have learned to call ancient, but they are not the beginning. Before the first scribe pressed a stylus into wet clay, before the first king's name was carved into stone, before the flood stories, before the creation myths, before the gods themselves were given names and temples, there was something else. Or perhaps someone else. In the dusty archives of museums across the world, thousands of cuneiform tablets sit in careful preservation. These fragments of baked earth contain the oldest written records known to humanity, stories set down by Sumerian scribes over 4,000 years ago. Among these texts, certain figures appear again and again. Divine beings, heavenly lords, the ones who came from above, the Anunnaki. To mainstream scholars, they represent a fascinating window into ancient religious thought, a pantheon of gods worshipped by one of humanity's earliest civilizations. To others, they represent something more mysterious, echoes, perhaps, of actual beings whose origins remain unclear even in the texts that describe them. But there is a question that emerges when one reads these ancient records closely. A question that does not announce itself immediately, but rather grows slowly in the spaces between the lines. Where did the Anunnaki come from? Not in the cosmic sense, though that question has certainly been asked, but in the narrative sense, in the chronological sense. The Sumerian texts describe a world that existed before the gods established their temples. They speak of a time before the flood, a cataclysmic deluge that wiped clean the surface of the earth and reset the course of human civilization. And when one examines the timing carefully, when one considers the peculiar gaps in the archaeological record, when one listens to the strange echoes that connect flood myths from Mesopotamia to India to the Americas, a haunting possibility begins to take shape. Did the Anunnaki appear in the aftermath of a world that was already lost? Were these divine figures, whatever their true nature, arrivals in a landscape that had already been swept clean, inheritors of a blank slate, or perhaps something else entirely, memories of an older order dressed in the clothing of gods by those who could no longer remember what they truly were? This is not an easy question to answer. It may in truth be a question without any answers at all, at least not ones we can prove with certainty. But it is a question worth asking. Over the next hour, we will journey deep into the cuneiform records of ancient Sumer. We will examine what the texts actually say about the Anunnaki, separating careful translation from modern embellishment. We will explore the enigmatic period before recorded history, a span of time that mainstream archaeology struggles to illuminate. We will consider the flood myths that appear across nearly every ancient culture, and we will ask whether these stories might contain genuine memories of a catastrophic reset. We will hear from multiple perspectives: the views of academic historians, the interpretations of alternative researchers, the symbolic readings of mythologists, and we will do our best to present each view fairly, without claiming to know more than the evidence allows. Because, in the end,
What matters most is not whether we arrive at a definitive conclusion, but whether we learn to ask better questions. So let us begin at the edge of memory itself.
This allegorical approach has a long history in religious and philosophical thought. Ancient interpreters, such as the Neoplatonists, read Greek myths as allegories for spiritual truths. Medieval scholars developed elaborate systems for reading biblical narratives on multiple levels simultaneously. Applied to Sumerian mythology, this method reveals layers of meaning that literal interpretation might overlook. The psychological interpretation, influenced by the work of Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, views the Anunnaki as projections of universal archetypes present in the collective unconscious of humanity. According to this framework, all humans share certain innate psychological patterns, the hero, the shadow, the wise elder, that manifest differently in different cultures but derived from the same deep structures of the psyche. The Anunnaki, from this perspective, represent the archetype of the divine parent or the higher self, those aspects of the psyche that seem to come from beyond the individual ego and guide human development from a source we experience as external and transcendent. This interpretation does not require any historical or literal truth behind the myths. It suggests instead that the myths are true psychologically, that they describe real features of human experience even if they do not correspond to external events. Finally, there are more speculative interpretations that propose non-human origins for the Anunnaki. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, popularized by Erich von Däniken and others, suggests that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings who visited Earth in the distant past and influenced human development. Some versions of this hypothesis propose that humans were genetically engineered by these beings, a literal reading of the myth of humanity's creation from clay and divine essence. It must be stated clearly that this interpretation has no support in mainstream science or scholarship. The textual evidence, when examined carefully, does not require an extraterrestrial explanation. The technological and archaeological evidence proposed in support of the hypothesis has been repeatedly criticized and debunked by experts in relevant fields. However, the persistence and popularity of the ancient astronaut hypothesis suggests that it speaks to something in the modern psyche, perhaps a longing for connection to something greater than ourselves, or a dissatisfaction with purely naturalistic explanations of human origins. Regardless of which interpretive framework one finds most compelling, the questions raised by the ancient texts remain genuinely interesting. Who were the Anunnaki to the people who worshipped them? What function did these stories serve in Sumerian society? And what, if anything, can they tell us about the deep past of human civilization? We began this investigation with a question about ancient texts and prehistoric worlds. But beneath that question lies something more fundamental, something that speaks to the deepest concerns of human existence. Who are we? Where did we come from? And what, if anything, has been forgotten? The fascination with the Anunnaki, with lost civilizations, with catastrophic resets of human history, is not merely idle curiosity. It reflects a genuine uncertainty about our own origins, an awareness that the official story of human development may be incomplete. Modern civilization tends to view itself as the culmination of a long process of progress. We look back at the past and see a gradual ascent from primitive beginnings to technological sophistication. The trajectory seems clear and inevitable, from caves to cities, from stone tools to computers, from superstition to science. But what if the past is not a straight line, but a cycle,
or a series of cycles interrupted by catastrophes that wiped the slate clean and forced humanity to begin again. The geological and climatological evidence suggests that Earth has experienced multiple dramatic transformations during the period of human existence. Ice ages have come and gone. Sea levels have risen and fallen by hundreds of meters. Volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, and climate shifts have repeatedly altered the conditions under which humans lived. If advanced civilizations existed during any of these periods, perhaps coastal civilizations, which would be most vulnerable to sea level rise, much of their physical legacy now lies beneath the ocean. This is not conspiracy theory. It is basic geology. The coastlines of the Pleistocene are not the coastlines of today. Any settlements that existed in low-lying coastal regions would have been inundated as the ice sheets melted and would remain buried beneath hundreds of feet of sediment. We do not know what existed in those submerged regions. Perhaps nothing of significance, perhaps only scattered bands of hunter-gatherers leaving no permanent trace, or perhaps something more, something we have not yet discovered because we have not yet looked in the right places. The question matters because it shapes how we understand ourselves. If human civilization has risen and fallen multiple times, if knowledge has been gained and lost repeatedly throughout prehistory, then our current technological civilization may be less stable and less unique than we typically assume. The achievements of modern science and industry, impressive as they are, may represent not the inevitable culmination of human progress, but merely one peak in a series of rises and falls extending into the darkness of time. This perspective invites humility. It suggests that wisdom, true wisdom, may have existed in the past as well as the present, perhaps in forms we no longer recognize or understand. The ancient texts, with their descriptions of divine beings who taught humanity the arts of civilization, may be pointing to exactly this: the transmission of knowledge across the gulf of catastrophe, the fragile thread connecting one age to the next. Whether the Anunnaki were gods, ancestors, survivors, symbols, or something else entirely, the stories about them emerge from a culture that believed it was not the first, that something had come before, had been lost, and had been partially recovered through divine intervention. That belief may tell us as much about the human condition as any archaeological discovery. We are creatures who remember. We are creatures who tell stories. And even when we cannot recall the specifics of what happened, we preserve the sense that something happened, something important, something transformative, something that must not be forgotten.
And so we arrive at the end of our inquiry, though in truth, there can be no ending to questions such as these. We have journeyed through the cuneiform tablets of ancient Sumer, those brittle fragments of clay that preserve humanity's oldest written memories. We have examined what the texts actually say about the Anunnaki, those divine beings who descended from heaven, who organized the cosmos, who participated in the creation of humanity. We have considered the world before recorded history, that vast expanse of time during which our ancestors lived, loved, created, and died without leaving any words to tell us who they were. We have looked at the gaps in the archaeological record, the tantalizing hints of sophistication that predate conventional timelines, the sites and structures that challenge easy explanation. We have explored the flood myths that echo across human cultures, the persistent memory of a great inundation that swept away an older world and forced survivors to begin again. We have examined the geological evidence for dramatic environmental changes at the end of the last ice age,
changes that would have transformed coastlines, devastated populations, and potentially erase entire civilizations from the map. We have asked whether the Anunnaki might have appeared in the aftermath of such a catastrophe, whether the stories about them might preserve, in mythological form, the memory of a transition between worlds. And we have listened to multiple perspectives. The mainstream scholarly view, which understands these texts as religious literature shaped by the same psychological and social forces that produce mythology everywhere. The cultural memory hypothesis, which suggests that myths may encode genuine historical information about the deep past. The symbolic and psychological interpretations, which find meaning in the myths regardless of their historical accuracy. Having considered all of this, what can we conclude? Perhaps only this, that certainty is not available to us. The ancient world did not leave us straightforward records. It left us fragments, tablets half destroyed, texts copied and recopied through generations, languages that we can only partially understand. Every translation is an interpretation. Every interpretation is shaped by the assumptions of the interpreter. We cannot prove that a lost civilization existed before the flood remembered in Sumerian texts. We cannot prove that the Anunnaki were anything other than mythological figures created by Bronze Age imaginations. We cannot prove that the gaps in our knowledge of prehistory conceal anything more than small bands of hunter-gatherers living simple lives. But we neither can prove the opposite. The absence of evidence, as we have noted, is not evidence of absence, particularly when we are dealing with time spans of thousands of years, environmental changes of catastrophic proportions, and a fragmentary archaeological record that has only begun to be systematically explored. What the Sumerian texts give us is a window into how ancient people understood their own past. They believed that they were not the first. They believed that the world had been destroyed and rebuilt. They believed that divine beings had intervened to establish order after chaos, to give laws, to teach arts, to descend from heaven with the gift of kingship. Whether this belief reflected genuine memory, symbolic psychology, or something beyond our current categories, it tells us something important about the human experience of time. We stand always on the edge of the abyss of forgetting. Behind us stretches an immensity we cannot fully see. Ahead of us lies an unknown we cannot predict. And in the present moment, we tell stories. Stories about where we came from. Stories about who came before. Stories about the beings who may have shaped the world we inherit. The Anunnaki are, in the end, a question posed by the past to the present. Who came before us? What did they know? What have we forgotten? These are not easy answers. They are questions that invite us to hold our certainties more lightly, to wonder whether the history we think we know might be only a fragment of a much longer, much stranger story. Perhaps there were worlds before this world. Perhaps there were beings who walked the earth before human memory began. Perhaps the ruins of lost ages lie beneath the sea or buried under the sediments of time, waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps the Anunnaki were always what they appear to be in the texts, gods, divine beings worshipped by a people long dead, whose stories survive only because someone, thousands of years ago, had the wisdom to press a stylus into clay and preserve a record. Either way, the mystery remains. And perhaps that is as it should be. For it is mystery that keeps us asking questions, mystery that drives us to explore, to excavate, to translate, to wonder. If we knew everything about the past, there would be no reason to investigate. If every question had an answer, curiosity would die. The Anunnaki are an invitation to remain curious, to look at the ancient world with fresh eyes, to question the assumptions we have inherited, to consider possibilities that our culture prefers to dismiss. They are, in short, an invitation to remember that we do not know as much as we think we do. And so, as the dust settles on these ancient questions, we leave you not with an answer, but with an echo, a whisper from 4,000 years ago, preserved in clay. A question asked by scribes who are long dead, posed to a future they could not imagine. Did something come before? Was there a world before this world? And if so, what does that mean for who we are now? The tablets do not tell us. Perhaps they never will. But the question remains, waiting, like the cuneiform itself, to be read by those with eyes to see. Good night.
There was a world before this world. It was destroyed by water. A few survivors carried forward the memory of what was lost, and from that memory, a new civilization was born. This is not a claim that requires belief in the supernatural. It is simply an observation about the remarkable consistency of human mythology. The Mesopotamian flood stories we have already examined have their parallels in the Hebrew Bible, of course, but the similarities extend far beyond the Judeo-Christian tradition. The Greeks remembered Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived a great flood sent by Zeus and repopulated the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders. The Hindus speak of Manu, warned by a divine fish to build a boat before the waters came. The Chinese record a great flood in the time of Emperor Yao, controlled only through the heroic efforts of the legendary Yu. Across the Pacific, indigenous cultures from Peru to the Pacific Northwest preserve memories of catastrophic inundation. The Hopi of North America speak of multiple worlds destroyed and recreated. The Mapuche of Chile tell of Kai Kai and Tren Tren, serpentine spirits whose battle caused the seas to rise. In India, the Andaman Islanders, among the most isolated people on Earth, have their own flood traditions. Skeptics often attribute these similarities to coincidence or to the universal human tendency to mythologize natural phenomena. River floods, tsunamis, and sea level changes have occurred throughout history, and it is entirely natural that human cultures would incorporate such experiences into their storytelling. But there is another possibility that deserves consideration. What if these myths remember the same event, or at least the same period of global catastrophe? The end of the last ice age, occurring roughly between 11,700 and 9,700 BCE, was marked by dramatic environmental changes that would have profoundly affected human populations worldwide. As the massive ice sheets covering North America and Northern Europe melted, sea levels rose by over 100 meters, a rise that would have inundated coastal regions across the globe and dramatically altered the geography of every inhabited continent. Within this broader period of change, certain events stand out as potentially catastrophic. The Younger Dryas, a mysterious cold snap that occurred approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, represents one of the most enigmatic chapters in recent Earth history. Just as the planet was warming from the last glacial maximum, temperatures suddenly plunged, particularly in the northern hemisphere, and remained cold for over 1,000 years before abruptly warming again. The cause of the Younger Dryas remains debated. Some scientists point to the disruption of Atlantic Ocean circulation as cold meltwater from North American glaciers altered current patterns. Others have proposed a more dramatic explanation, a comet or asteroid impact that injected dust and debris into the atmosphere, triggering widespread cooling and potentially continent-wide fires. The impact hypothesis, while controversial, has gained support from the discovery of unusual geological layers dating to the onset of the Younger Dryas. These layers, found across North America and parts of Europe, contain elevated levels of iridium, nanodiamonds, and other materials consistent with an extraterrestrial impact or airburst event. If such an impact occurred, whether into the Laurentide ice sheet or elsewhere, the consequences would have been catastrophic. Massive flooding from rapidly melting ice, widespread fires from the impact blast, climate disruption lasting centuries, the extinction of megafauna including the woolly mammoth, the saber-toothed cat, and the giant ground sloth, and potentially the collapse of any human societies that existed at the time. This brings us to a question that mainstream archaeology has only recently begun to seriously consider. What if there were relatively advanced cultures before the Younger Dryas event? Cultures that were destroyed so thoroughly that almost nothing survived. The conventional view holds that before the Neolithic Revolution, the development of agriculture and settled communities beginning around 10,000 BCE, humans lived exclusively as nomadic hunter-gatherers in small, dispersed groups. But Göbekli Tepe, with its massive carved pillars and sophisticated construction techniques dating immediately after the Younger Dryas, challenges this assumption. How did supposedly primitive people suddenly develop the organizational capacity and technical knowledge to build such a monument? Where did this culture come from? One possibility, suggested by researchers such as Graham Hancock, is that Göbekli Tepe is not a sudden beginning, but a continuation, a remnant of knowledge that survived from an earlier, more sophisticated culture destroyed by the Younger Dryas catastrophe. This is speculation, to be clear. It is not proven, and mainstream archaeology remains skeptical. But it is speculation that aligns intriguingly with the mythological record. The Sumerian king list, with its impossible reign lengths and its clear division between the world before the flood and the world after the flood, reads differently when considered against this geological and climatological backdrop. What if the flood remembered in Mesopotamian texts was not a localized river event, but a global catastrophe, one that brought an end to an earlier era of human development and left only scattered survivors to rebuild? And what if the Anunnaki, whatever they truly were, appeared in the aftermath of that catastrophe, either as actual beings who established themselves in a depopulated world, or as mythological constructs created by survivors to explain the devastation they had witnessed and the knowledge they had lost? Let us now approach the central question of this investigation with care and intellectual humility. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as having existed from the beginning, from before the creation of humanity, from before the establishment of cities, from the primordial time when the cosmos itself was being ordered. On the surface, this would seem to place them prior to any hypothetical lost world rather than after it. But ancient texts are rarely straightforward, and their chronologies are often symbolic rather than literal. Consider how the Sumerians understood time. Unlike modern historians who think in terms of linear progression and precise dating, the ancient Mesopotamians organized their past into mythological eras defined by divine action. The time before the flood was qualitatively different from the time after. It was not merely earlier, it was fundamentally other, a different kind of existence governed by different rules. When the Sumerian king list states that the kingship descended from heaven, it is describing a moment of transition, a point at which divine authority was transferred to the earthly realm. But was this original descent truly at the beginning of all things, or was it at the beginning of the current era, the world that emerged after whatever catastrophe the flood represents?
One interpretation suggests that the Anunnaki, at least as they appear in Sumerian religion, were figures who organized and civilized the post-catastrophe world. Whether they were literal beings, mythological memory of earlier human leaders, or symbolic personifications of natural and cosmic forces, they represented order emerging from chaos, the re-establishment of law and structure after a period of destruction. This interpretation aligns with a common pattern in human mythology. After every great catastrophe, whether flood, fire, plague, or conquest, cultures tend to remember a period of divine intervention that restored order. The gods came down, the ancestors taught, the sacred laws were given, civilization resumed. From a psychological perspective, this makes sense. Trauma demands narrative. When the world collapses, survivors need a story that explains what happened and why, a story that provides meaning and hope for the future. The Anunnaki may have served precisely this function for the early Mesopotamians. They were the explanation for how order was restored after the unimaginable disaster that ended the previous world. But there is another reading possible, one that takes the texts more literally while still allowing for mystery. What if the Anunnaki were real, not in the sense of literal gods or extraterrestrial beings, but in the sense of an actual group of individuals or a civilization that arrived in Mesopotamia after the flood? Consider the Sumerian claim that their culture came from the sea. Consider the legend of Oannes recorded by the Babylonian priest Berosus in the 3rd century BCE, a being who emerged from the Persian Gulf and taught humanity the arts of civilization. Consider the mysterious origins of Sumerian language, which has no known relatives and may represent a population that migrated from elsewhere. If there were survivors of a pre-flood civilization, survivors who had retained technical knowledge and organizational ability, they might well have appeared to more primitive populations.
Populations as godlike beings. Their knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, medicine, and law would have seemed miraculous. Their arrival would have marked the beginning of a new era. Over time, as generations passed and memories faded, these culture-bearing ancestors might have been elevated to fully divine status. Their teachings became sacred laws, their names became the names of gods, and the story of their arrival became intertwined with cosmological myths until it was no longer possible to distinguish historical memory from religious narrative. This is the cultural memory hypothesis. The idea that myths often contain distorted but genuine recollections of actual events and people from the deep past. It must be emphasized that this remains speculation. We have no archaeological evidence directly confirming the existence of a pre-flood advanced civilization in Mesopotamia or anywhere else. The cuneiform texts do not explicitly state that the Anunnaki were refugees or survivors from an earlier culture. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly when we are dealing with events that, if they occurred, took place 12,000 or more years ago in regions that have been continuously inhabited, repeatedly excavated, and subjected to thousands of years of geological change. What the texts do provide is a framework for asking questions. They describe a world before and a world after. They speak of beings who came from elsewhere to establish order. They remember a time of destruction followed by renewal. Whether these narratives reflect literal history, symbolic psychology, or something in between remains for each investigator to consider. Before proceeding further into speculative territory, it is essential that we present the mainstream scholarly perspective on these questions. Academic historians and archaeologists have devoted considerable effort to understanding Mesopotamian civilization and its mythology, and their conclusions deserve respectful consideration. The predominant view among scholars is that Sumerian mythology, including the stories of the Anunnaki, should be understood as religious literature rather than historical documentation. Like the Greek myths of Zeus and the Olympians, or the Norse tales of Odin and Thor, The Mesopotamian divine narratives served social, psychological, and political functions within their cultural context. According to this view, the Anunnaki were personifications of natural forces, celestial bodies, and abstract concepts that the Sumerians sought to understand and influence through ritual and worship. Anu, the sky god, represented the heavens above. Enlil embodied the power of wind and storm. Enki was associated with water, wisdom, and craft. These were not beings who literally walked the earth, but rather symbolic figures through which humans related to the overwhelming forces of nature. The flood stories, from this perspective, likely originated in memories of actual flooding events in Mesopotamia, a region prone to devastating river inundations. The Tigris and Euphrates are unpredictable rivers, and ancient Mesopotamian cities would have experienced catastrophic floods multiple times throughout their history. Over generations, these separate flood events may have merged into cultural memory into a single cosmic deluge. The impossibly long reign lengths in the Sumerian king list are typically explained as either numerical exaggeration for political purposes, demonstrating the antiquity and divine favor of particular dynasties, or as reflecting some counting system we no longer understand. Efforts have been made to find mathematical patterns in the numbers that might reveal hidden meaning, but no consensus has emerged. As for the origins of Sumerian civilization, most scholars attribute its apparent sudden appearance to gaps in the archaeological record rather than to any genuinely mysterious process. Earlier developmental phases likely existed but left less durable remains. The alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia are prone to flooding and sedimentation, which may have buried or destroyed evidence of earlier settlements. This conservative interpretation has much to recommend it. It is parsimonious, requiring no extraordinary explanations for phenomena that can be understood through ordinary human psychology, religious development, and political motivation. It is supported by comparative mythology, which shows similar patterns of divine hierarchy and flood narrative across many cultures that had no contact with one another. Furthermore, mainstream scholarship notes that popular interpretations of the Anunnaki, particularly those suggesting extraterrestrial origins, often rely on mistranslations, selective quoting, and misunderstanding of Sumerian language and culture. The work of serious Assyriologists who spend decades learning to read cuneiform texts in their original languages frequently contradicts the claims made in popular alternative literature. This is an important caution. The cuneiform record is difficult to access, and it is easy for non-specialists to be misled by translations that emphasize certain words or phrases while ignoring context. Scholarly humility requires acknowledging that most of us are dependent on the expertise of others when it comes to understanding these ancient texts. At the same time, it is worth noting that scholarly opinion is not monolithic, and mainstream interpretations are not beyond question. The very scholars who caution against sensationalism also acknowledge that Sumerian civilization remains genuinely mysterious in certain respects. The origin of the Sumerian language is unknown. The precise mechanisms by which complex society emerged so rapidly remain debated, and the meaning of many cuneiform texts, particularly older and fragmentary ones, is uncertain even among experts. Mythology, moreover, is not always pure fiction. Heinrich Schliemann discovered Troy by taking Homer seriously. The biblical account of the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem was confirmed by archaeology. The Indian epics contain geographical and cultural details that reflect genuine historical conditions. The question is not whether mythology should be taken literally in every detail, but whether it might contain, encoded within its symbols and narratives, genuine information about the past that deserves careful investigation. Beyond the mainstream academic view, several alternative frameworks have been proposed for understanding the Anunnaki and their relationship to human origins.
These interpretations vary widely in their plausibility and evidence base, but each offers a different lens through which to view the ancient texts. The cultural memory hypothesis, which we touched upon earlier, suggests that ancient myths preserve distorted but genuine memories of historical events and people from the deep past. According to this view, the Anunnaki may represent a cultural memory of actual individuals, perhaps leaders of a more advanced culture, who arrived in Mesopotamia after a catastrophic event and helped establish the foundations of Sumerian civilization. This interpretation finds support in anthropological studies of how oral traditions preserve information over long periods. Research among indigenous Australian cultures, for example, has shown that oral traditions can accurately preserve memories of geographical changes, such as sea level rise, for over 7,000 years. If oral tradition can preserve such information, it may also preserve distorted memories of important historical figures who, over generations, became elevated to divine status. The symbolic or allegorical interpretation proposes that the Anunnaki should be understood as personifications of cosmic principles, natural forces, or stages of psychological development, rather than literal beings. In this view, the myths are sophisticated philosophical or spiritual texts encoded in narrative form. The descent of the Anunnaki from heaven, for instance, might symbolize the emergence of consciousness from the unconscious, the moment when human beings became aware of themselves as separate from nature. The creation of humanity from clay mixed with divine blood might represent the dual nature of human existence, earthly and mortal, yet touched by.
Every Sumerian city was, in a very real sense, a temple complex. The city belonged to its patron god, and the human inhabitants were caretakers, servants, and worshippers. The great ziggurats, those stepped pyramidal structures that dominated the Mesopotamian landscape, were not tombs like the pyramids of Egypt, but rather raised platforms designed to bring humans closer to the divine realm, or perhaps to provide a landing place for beings who came from above. The third theme, and the one most relevant to our inquiry, is the memory of a time before. The Sumerian King List, a document that catalogs the rulers of Mesopotamia from the earliest times to the compiler's present, begins with a remarkable statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Descended from heaven. The list then provides the names and reign lengths of 8 kings who ruled before the flood. These reign lengths are extraordinary by any standard, spanning tens of thousands of years in some cases. The king Alulim, for example, is said to have ruled Eridu for 28,800 years. After listing these 8 antediluvian kings, the text states simply, "Then the flood swept over." Following the flood, the kingship descended from heaven again, and a new line of rulers began, with reign lengths that, while still extended, gradually decreased toward more human proportions. What are we to make of this document? Some scholars view it as purely mythological, an attempt to provide divine legitimacy to contemporary rulers by connecting them to an imagined sacred past. Others suggest that the impossibly long reign lengths may represent some kind of numerical encoding or calendrical system that we no longer understand. Still others propose that the flood represents a genuine historical memory, a catastrophic event that reset civilization and separated the mythical past from the historical present. And then there is the most intriguing question of all. If kingship descended from heaven, who brought it down? The answer, according to Sumerian texts, is the Anunnaki. The word Anunnaki has become, in modern popular culture, something of a lightning rod for controversy.
Depending on whom you ask, these figures were either ancient astronauts who genetically engineered humanity, a class of divine beings who governed cosmic affairs, or simply mythological characters invented by Bronze Age storytellers. But what do the texts actually say? Let us begin with the name itself. In Sumerian, Anunnaki is generally understood as a compound of Anu, the sky god, the supreme deity of the Sumerian pantheon, and Ki, meaning earth. Some scholars translate this as those of royal blood or princely offspring, while others interpret it as those who came from heaven to earth. The distinction is significant. The first translation emphasizes nobility and divine status. The second implies motion, a descent from somewhere else. In the earliest Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are presented as the collective group of major deities who make important decisions about the cosmos and humanity's fate. They are not a single being, but rather a council, a divine assembly that meets to deliberate on matters of cosmic importance. The most important texts for understanding the Anunnaki are the great Mesopotamian creation and flood narratives, the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, and the later Babylonian Enuma Elish. Each of these texts provides a slightly different perspective on who the Anunnaki were and what role they played in human affairs. In the Atrahasis epic, dating to approximately 1700 BCE, but believed to be based on much older Sumerian sources, the Anunnaki appear as the great gods who, in the beginning, assigned roles to the divine hierarchy. Above were the Anunnaki, below were the Igigi, a class of lesser gods tasked with performing labor, digging canals, dredging rivers, and maintaining the irrigation systems upon which civilization depended. According to Atrahasis, the Igigi eventually grew weary of their labor and rebelled. In response, the great god Enki proposed a solution, the creation of a new being, humanity, to take over the work of the Igigi and serve the gods. The text describes how the goddess Nintu mixed clay with the blood of a slain god to create the first humans, beings who would bear the burden of labor so that the gods could rest. This is, on one level, a straightforward creation myth, an explanation for why humans exist and what purpose they serve in the cosmic order. But several elements invite deeper consideration. First, there is the striking parallel to modern questions about labor, creation, and purpose. Were humans, in the Sumerian view, essentially a workforce designed to serve beings more powerful than themselves? Second is the curious detail of mixing clay with divine blood. This suggests that humanity, in the Sumerian conception, was not entirely separate from the divine realm, that something of the gods was embedded in human nature from the beginning. And third, and most relevant to our inquiry, is the question of timeline. When did this creation take place? The Atrahasis epic, like the Sumerian king list, speaks of a time before the flood, a great deluge that would later destroy most of humanity and necessitate a new beginning. The flood narrative of Atrahasis shares clear parallels with the later Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh and, of course, with the biblical story of Noah. A righteous man is warned of an impending catastrophe. He is instructed to build a vessel. He gathers his family and various animals. The waters come. The world is destroyed. The waters recede. Life begins again. What is striking about the Mesopotamian versions is what happens afterwards. In Atrahasis, following the flood, the gods establish a new order. Restrictions are placed on human reproduction. The previous age is definitively ended, and the world that emerges from the waters is fundamentally different from the world that existed before. This raises a crucial question. If the Anunnaki were already present before the flood, if they created humanity and oversaw the antediluvian world, then were they governing during the era of the impossibly long-reigning kings mentioned in the Sumerian king list? Were they present during whatever civilization, if any, existed before the catastrophe? Or, and here is where the mystery, history begins somewhere around 3200 BCE, perhaps earlier in some regions, perhaps later in others, when the first recognizable writing systems appeared in Mesopotamia and Egypt. But this leaves an enormous question unanswered. What came before? The academic term for this vast expanse of time is prehistory, a word that, by its very construction, suggests absence. Prehistory, before the story, before the record. The implication is that before writing existed, there is nothing we can truly know, only fragments, artifacts, and educated guesses. This framing, while practical for academic purposes, conceals a profound mystery. Modern humans, Homo sapiens in their current anatomical form, have existed for at least 300,000 years. Some recent discoveries in Morocco have pushed this estimate even further back. For the overwhelming majority of this time, our ancestors lived, died, loved, suffered, built, and created without leaving any written record of their existence. 300,000 years. And yet, according to the conventional narrative, the spark of complex civilization appeared only in the last 5,000 or 6,000 years. Agriculture, cities, writing, organized religion, mathematics, astronomy, all of these emerged in what amounts to a tiny fraction of human existence, a sliver at the very end of an incomprehensibly long timeline. Some scholars have begun to question whether this narrative is complete. The problem is not necessarily one of dishonesty or oversight. Archaeologists and historians are limited by what survives. Stone endures, pottery endures, metal endures under the right conditions, but wood rots, textiles decay. Anything built from organic materials, no matter how sophisticated, eventually returns to the earth from which it came. Consider what would remain of our own civilization if it were buried for 12,000 years. The steel skeletons of our tallest buildings would rust to nothing. Our books, our art, our digital archives, all of it would vanish. Perhaps some ceramic tiles might survive, perhaps some glass, perhaps the foundations of our most massive structures if they were built upon bedrock in regions without seismic activity. But the vast majority of what defines us would be lost. Now consider what might have existed in the deep past, in those long millennia before the conventionally accepted dawn of civilization. We know that our ancestors were capable of sophisticated thought. The cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira demonstrate artistic awareness and symbolic thinking dating back over 30,000 years. The Lion Man of the Hohensteinstadel, a carved ivory figurine depicting a human-lion hybrid, suggests complex mythology and abstract reasoning at least 40,000 years ago. Yet for most of this period, we have assumed that humans lived as small bands of hunter-gatherers, without permanent settlements, without written records, without the institutions we associate with civilization. But here is where the evidence becomes more complicated. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey fundamentally challenged the timeline of human development. This site, consisting of massive stone pillars arranged in circular formations and decorated with intricate carvings of animals and abstract symbols, dates to approximately 9600 BCE, making it over 6,000 years older than Stonehenge and predating the accepted invention of agriculture by at least a millennium. The implications of Göbekli Tepe remain hotly debated. How did supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers organize the labor and resources necessary to construct such a monument? What beliefs or purposes motivated them? And most mysteriously, why was the site deliberately buried around 8000 BCE, as though someone wished to preserve it or hide it for future ages? Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Across the globe, there are sites and artifacts that do not fit neatly into the conventional timeline. Underwater structures off the coasts of Japan, India, and the Mediterranean, precision-cut stone blocks in South America that modern engineers struggle to explain, astronomical alignments in monuments that suggest sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. None of this proves the existence of a lost advanced civilization, but it does raise questions about what we might not know, about the gaps in our understanding of the deep past. And it is precisely into these gaps that the ancient myths speak. Nearly every culture on Earth preserves some memory of a golden age, an earlier time when the world was different. The Greeks called it the Age of Kronos. The Hindus speak of the Satya Yuga. The Egyptians remembered the Zep Tepi, the first time when the gods walked the earth. And the Sumerians wrote of the time before the flood, a time when the Anunnaki ruled, when kings lived for thousands of years, when the world was young and the division between heaven and earth was not yet fixed. What if these stories are not merely imaginative fictions? What if they contain, encoded in the language of myth, genuine memories of an older world, a world that ended in catastrophe and was gradually forgotten? This is the question that draws us deeper into the cuneiform record. In the alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in a region the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, one of humanity's earliest known civilizations emerged. We call them the Sumerians, though this was not what they called themselves. In their own language, they were the black-headed people, and their land was simply the land, Kengir, a place they believed was uniquely blessed by the gods. Sumerian civilization presents us with a paradox. On one hand, it is among the oldest complex societies for which we have substantial written records. On the other hand, its origins remain genuinely mysterious, even to the